is the National Association of Scholars' first live in-person event since February of last year. We then held a conference called Fixing Science in Oakland, California. Well, we're back. We wanted the world to know that we are willing to stray from home, so we're out of New York City and in Fort Lauderdale, Florida for this event. We decided to take the plunge and hold a live event because we want the world to know that we are alive and kicking and doing our part. We've held numerous Zoom conferences over this last year, but this time we're seeing if we can get people to speak to each other in person. Turns out that most of the audience for this conference, however, is not in the room I'm speaking in. I'm looking out over a very vast empty space, mostly empty space. It turns out to be that the COVID concern, the tension that we feel when we're now in the presence of other people is still preventing lots of people from coming out. But nonetheless, we welcome the several hundred who have signed up for this event and are watching it live. Well, I'm here to tell you that the weather here in sunny Florida is exactly that. I've seen my shadow, so I think the end of winter is somewhere in sight. And that end of winter brings with it the promise of many more events like this. Priced Out addresses a central scandal in American higher education: the cruel waste of trillions of dollars in the form of student tuition. America's universities have been raising their tuition steadily for decades on end, so rapidly that they've absorbed all of the federal aid available and then some. They have gone on to gouge additional trillions of dollars out of the pockets of students and their parents who can only attend college by going into debt. Government subsidies have facilitated colleges' expansion into non-academic areas. They have enabled colleges to engage in a kind of price gouging, knowing that those tuition costs are going to be partly offset by money that the federal government lends to students. The central problem that we face is that far too many students have decided that college is their only secure path to a livelihood that's substantial in the future. And there are many cases they're mistaken about that, but nonetheless, it has become the prevailing belief that a college diploma, not a college education, is an indispensable attainment. The result of this market inflexibility, the determination of students to attend college and seek that degree, is that colleges have allowed their budgets to balloon. And the advantage that they've taken from this ballooning of their budgets has not been to improve the quality of education or expand the number of faculty or the variety of courses. Generally, it has taken the form of a massive growth in the number of college administrators performing all sorts of services, from encouraging racial resentment to teaching students that they are so frail that they need constant therapy more than they need education. We don't want to excuse students from the responsibility that they have taken out these loans voluntarily, but we do think that there is something to be said for the systematic ways in which this profligacy has been incentivized and encouraged. The policy recommendations that we are about to put forward come in several different directions, but I'm going to let Neetu Arnold explain those when she speaks after me. Neetu Arnold, who I'll introduce virtually at this point, has been working on this report for 18 months. She's a relatively new hire to the National Association of Scholars. Before that, she was a working journalist. She's a graduate of Cornell University, originally born in India, but grew up and was educated in the United States. Neetu has a very talented manner of handling the complex statistics that go into this report. And one of the things we're really proudest of is how well she has nailed down her analysis to comprehensible statistics. So that's indeed a part of the report, but the narration is just as important. We are also fortunate to have today three excellent panelists to comment on Priced Out and related matters. Adam Kissel, who is now a senior fellow at the Cardinal Institute, Jenna Robinson, who's president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, and Alan Mendenhall, associate dean in the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University and a longstanding NAS member. Um, they bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this issue from federal, state, and local levels, and I'm delighted that they've been willing to join us in our launch. I'm also delighted that you will get a chance to hear now from Neetu. Neetu, please take the podium.
Well, first, Peter, thank you for that introduction. And I'd also like to thank everybody who made this event possible. I'd especially like to thank Adam Kissel, Jenna Robinson, and Alan Mendenhall for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us as our panelists today. So, about this time last year, all the news outlets had headline stories about how college students needed to pack their bags, move out of their dorms, and find transportation to get home in a matter of days. If everyone followed the new social distancing guidelines to flatten the curve of the coronavirus pandemic, we'd be out of lockdown in a few months. The students went home, but we're not out of lockdown yet. Now, at the time, I was visiting friends at Cornell University, my alma mater in Ithaca, New York. Around this time of year, the cherry blossoms are just beginning to bud. The warmth of oncoming spring gives everyone hope at last after the long, hard winters of upstate New York. And if you've been there, you know how cold it gets. But this time, something felt different. The mood on campus was somber and uneasy, and it wasn't just because of the COVID headlines. Some, especially those in their final year, were unsure if they would see their college friends again or whether there would be a formal graduation ceremony. For others, they were confused about how classes would operate and whether Cornell would give them a rebate for the tuition since they wouldn't be on campus anymore. But Cornell, like many schools across the country, was keeping the money that students paid for tuition. Now, some schools like Duke University swiftly reimbursed residential students for, quote, paid but unused housing and dining fees. But far more schools hesitated for weeks or months, left their students in the dark, and finally announced that it was already too far into the semester to offer refunds. Besides, students weren't really paying for a college education, but for the expensive piece of paper that said you had been to college. University of Maryland Chancellor Jay Perman put matters bluntly in an April 2020 Washington Post article. Quote, when people pay tuition, they are paying for credit and ultimately for a degree. Now, cynics have always said that the point of college is just the transcript and the degree. Now, an administrator taking in millions in tuition to run an empty campus seemed to be saying the exact same thing. These weren't just a few poorly chosen words. And the trouble wasn't that Chancellor Perman had lied or distorted the situation. In fact, he said the quiet part out loud, a truth about the way higher education's been operating for a long time, and which the pandemic made obvious as it emptied out America's campuses. Higher education administrators take an enormous amount of money from students, and what they give back is a degree that's just as useful whether the student actually went to college or simply stayed at home. No matter what, the administrators get paid. That's certainly the case at Chancellor Perman's own University of Maryland. The University of Maryland at College Park pays an average salary of $109,000 annually to administrators and staff who work in the Academy for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which we will refer to as I&E. Now, if you peruse I&E's website, the educational purpose is unclear at first, but you will find buzzwords like inspiration, empathy, fearless, casually strewn about, but of little substance. Further investigation shows activism courses disguised under the feel good word entrepreneurship. Many courses at Maryland are cross listed with I&E. For example, strategy for social activism is cross listed with the Arts and Humanities Department. A more alarming example is a course called Engineering for Social Change, which is cross listed with the Engineering Department. Now, the Academy's greatest added value comes from creating activities such as the empathy map, which is right up here. And this map helps students learn how to organize what a person says, does, feels, or thinks. I actually tried this activity, just for research purposes. Here's the proof that I did it. And I really have to say, it didn't require a lot of thought. And I think if there's one thing you take away from this activity, it's that if you follow the path that they've set for you, you'll end up at the conclusions that they've already written. But if you try to think for yourself, they will put a brick wall in your way. The maze teaches you to follow instructions, but not much about actual empathy. Now remember, the average salary for I&D administrators and staff is $109,000, and the activities offered are equivalent to a kid's restaurant handout passed off as a training material for college students. But when people pay tuition, said Chancellor Perman, they are paying for credit and ultimately for a degree. Now, colleges didn't used to have this kind of money to throw around. Their revenues and expenditures have grown enormously since 1980. Now, how they got there to where they are today is a long and complicated story, but it mainly consists of three parts: government subsidy through federal student aid, large scale marketing campaigns of a scale and efficacy that would make Walter Lippmann smile, and the emergence of the college degree as the necessary credential for a good career. Government sub oops. Government subsidy of higher education through federal student aid has two roots. The GI Bill of 1944 showed that it was possible to use federal money to pay for the college education of millions of Americans, and the Truman Commission report of 1947, which provided the philosophical foundation for higher education for all. The fruit of the GI Bill and the Truman Commission was the Higher Education Act of 1965, which created the system of federal student aid that we have today. Amendments in the following decades reauthorized and expanded federal student aid, most importantly by adding subsidized student loans. In the 1970s and 80s, and as economic hard times followed the post-war golden age, many young Americans chose to attend cheap community colleges, and some decided not to attend college at all. Higher education institutions competed fiercely for the remaining students and began to adopt techniques from the marketing revolution to promote effective student recruitment, retention, and enrollment. In the process, however, marketing priorities began to outweigh the priorities of higher education. As scholar Larry Litton pointed out in a 1980 essay, the marketing concept focuses on consumer satisfaction, whereas higher education is, quote, charged with the responsibility of carrying out the educational and scholarly activities of our society in a manner congruent with our cultural tradition. In reality, this turned into providing luxuries such as lazy pools, wilderness therapy workshops, and zip lines. Luxuries administrators believed the students would want from an educational institution. Colleges also invested in student services to retain students and make sure they paid their full 4 years of tuition. student enrollment mattered more than student education. A college degree also became the crucial job credential for middle class Americans. In 1971, the Supreme Court ruled in Griggs versus Duke Power Company that employers could not use intelligence or aptitude tests to screen potential employees if such tests had a disparate impact by race, sex, or any other protected class. The unanticipated consequence was that employers began to use college degrees as a proxy for aptitude tests. Millions of young Americans decided they had to go to college, and they were willing to pay a high price for the degree that would qualify them for decent jobs. The marketing revolution and the Supreme Court made millions of Americans want a college degree. The federal student aid system gave them the ability to satisfy their desire, or at least it seemed to. But when the government provided student aid, colleges responded by raising their tuition. The government increased its aid, and the colleges raised their tuition again. Eventually, government student aid couldn't match the tuition increases. And one thing our report shows is that colleges have raised tuition steadily for 40 years, regardless of how much money they receive from federal and state governments. But young Americans kept going to college. They thought they had to. The lure of college enamored them, and the need for a college degree made them desperate. So they took out even more loans from the government, loans they were forbidden to discharge into bankruptcy. What started as a government subsidy of college tuition to help make college more affordable ended up trapping college graduates and dropouts in a mountain of debt. And when I say a mountain of debt, I mean $1.7 trillion of student debt and counting. College tuition prices have more than doubled in real dollars in the last 40 years, increasing at a faster rate than per capita income. Now, to paraphrase Stalin, the bankruptcy of millions is a statistic, but the bankruptcy of one person is a tragedy. For Priced Out, we interviewed dozens of students and families from all over the country about their experiences with college, debt, and rising tuition. Their individual stories provide truths about college debt that data cannot. One father worked overtime for years to make enough money so that he could keep his children out of debt. Some would say he was responsible, but tragically, the long hours at work broke his marriage. Jennifer Martinez immigrated from the Dominican Republic at 17 and looked to higher education as her way to achieve the American dream. She worked as a waitress in New York City to pay for community college and eventually attended Cornell for her bachelor's and Columbia for her master's degree. In the process, she accumulated 6 figures in student loan debt. Her journalist salary won't pay off the debt for many years. She says, quote, "It feels depressing to know how hard you've been working, and at the end of the day, you have all this money to pay." Gene Bryant took out 6 figures in loans to reduce the debt burden for his children. A family member pitched in to help his daughter become a veterinarian, a dream she had since she was 6 years old. Gene is grateful for this family member, but he worries about how much money was spent for his daughter's education. Now, I share these examples not to tell a few sob stories about innocent people getting into trouble through no fault of their own. In fact, most students and families we interviewed said straight out that their own choices had gotten them into debt and that it was their responsibility to pay off their student loans. Some of the most heavily indebted were eager to share the lessons they had learned so that they could help other young Americans avoid the same mistakes they made. They're decent people in a hard place, and you can tell they're decent because they don't try to blame anybody else for their choices. Now, it doesn't mean that they're not looking for solutions, and young Americans are responsible for their fair share of the student debt crisis. That doesn't mean the rest of America can just ignore it. Once we've finished assigning responsibility, the student debt crisis still endangers our country. Socially, high levels of student debt contribute to many young Americans' decision to delay marriage, sometimes indefinitely. They also delay having children and buying a home. And we know that marriage, children, and home are the anchors of society, and student debt weakens all three. Economically, student debt eats up trillions of dollars that could have been invested productively. And politically, even though many young college graduates take responsibility for their loans, far too many become willing to entertain radical redistributive policies such as free college, universal basic income, universal health care, and of course, student debt forgiveness. Many times, the students are taught these ideologies on campus. These are high costs to pay, and they are not actually paying for improved instruction. They are also going toward expanding college administrations, or what we call administrative bloat. Now, we're not just using administrative bloat as a loose term of abuse. In Priced Out, we provide a precise definition of administrative bloat, which is the wasteful expansion of spending on administrators and staff. And wasteful in this context means not directly relevant to instruction. The main thing administrative bloat buys is more administrators. In 2018, there were 2.6 administrators for every full-time instructor at 4-year public and private universities. When administrators outnumber professors, naturally the priorities are going to skew outside the scope of instruction. Administrators hire plenty of full-time administrators, but they prefer to hire part-time faculty rather than full-time professors. Universities divert their resources from classroom instruction to marketing, public relations, and government relations. Ideologically motivated administrators divert further university resources to pay for diversity officers, bias response teams, and student life staff dedicated to social justice. When people pay tuition, they are paying for credit and ultimately for a degree. And since they're not paying for an education, they pay for an awful lot of the waste in our higher education systems. Now, just to recap, because we've just discussed a lot here, we've seen how colleges serve as gatekeepers to good jobs and good opportunities. Parents and students make decisions that consider a lot more than just the finances. And although a college degree is more expensive, it doesn't necessarily mean it's increased in value. So, what do we do about all of this? Well, first, Americans need to break the student loan cycle. We shouldn't just forgive student loan debt. That will just work as another subsidy to fund administrative bloat. We need to change incentives for young Americans so they stop taking out student loans, and we need to make university bureaucracies slim down. We need to give young Americans alternatives to college. Universities, particularly public institutions, should create 2 to 3 year vocational tracks with classes staffed by industry veterans. We also need to educate students with financial literacy so they understand the weight of the debt they might have to pay should they take it out. We should change the law to allow companies to use something besides a college degree as a job credential. And by any means necessary, we need to break the cloud of fear that makes students willing to pay any price for a college degree. We also need to reduce administrative bloat drastically. States should make public university employee data searchable and accessible via an online database to provide the public and policymakers the ability to scrutinize exactly how universities use their money and to inform them which positions should be eliminated. States should also require public universities to cut costs by consolidating duplicate offices. Substantial changes to higher education are needed. Young Americans face a long, hard winter. It won't be spring until we break the vicious cycle of administrative bloat and student debt. Thank you. Um, Peter, did you want to introduce the next speaker? Okay, we will have Adam Kissel go next.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we're talking about a lot of money. $1.7 trillion is a lot. It's the amount of one stimulus package. But uh, we're talking about uh, a risk that students take on themselves before they even know what the risks are. They don't even know what sources to go to understand who they should trust to understand the risks. But, and that's kind of by definition because they go to college saying, you know what, I am not educated yet. I need other people to tell me how to think better, and I need to practice that. And then I'll be able to take some risks on myself. Well, by the time you've done that, you've already paid the tuition, and you might find out that you made a bad choice. So there's inherent tension in the system of higher ed where the student needs to trust, but doesn't even know how to trust. So first I want to talk about uh, students, and there's two ways that students may leave college early. One is by not being ready for college and they drop out, and one is by being so good that they don't need to spend the whole 4 years. So we should talk about both ends of that. So for instance, let's say you get really good vocational and other counseling as a high school junior and senior, and you say, you know what, I actually know what my major is going to be. I know what my career path is going to be. I'm going to take dual enrollment classes. And I'm going to get out in 3 years. So you're really saving not just the fourth year of college, but also you're adding a year to your working life. So part of the cultural reason that people have to and very expensively spend the full 4 years, I think ought to change so that there's a new cultural standard like they have outside the United States in many places. And there's a college professor who, I mean, a college president who is really working with me on this to say, you know what, the new standard really should be get in and out in 3 years, get enough background so that you can figure out ahead of time what you're going to do. And if you change your mind, you take 4, that's fine. It's still better than the people who take 6, which is an awful lot of students. So, so that's, you know, for the students who get good counseling. But let's say you also get counseling in your first semester and at the end of your first year, and the counselor says to you, all right, are you cut out to stay here or not? Or do you want to choose a vocational track? So the idea that there could be a way to stay in the same institution and still graduate within a few years, I like. There might also be some different kinds of off-ramps, however. So Beth Akers at American Enterprise Institute has offered some ideas for how you can do some off-ramping without as much debt so that you're not really on the hook for your whole first year's worth of tuition. So that's something to look for as an alternative. So the off-ramp could be financial, but it also could be turning to vocational education instead of your traditional liberal arts degree if that's what you went in for. Or maybe you find a way to go down to community college because that's actually the way, those are the people who actually have the different kinds of resources at very low cost that can put you on the track that you want. We do that at the high school level. You can choose a vocational school instead of the traditional high school. Why not also do that at the college level? Send you without any shame at all to a degree that's probably not a degree, but a credential that will make up a big difference between your $1 million debt and going to Starbucks to work or being a plumber like my great grandfather was and making $150 an hour. So the dignity of work needs to be explained in a much more serious way by counselors, both in high school and at college. So that's on the student side. On the administration side, I love these concepts of woke and broke, right? And that applies not just to the students who get woke and also broke, but to colleges. And we know, especially in the COVID era, that a lot of colleges are struggling and are just about to go out of business if they haven't admitted it yet. Externally, they've admitted it internally and to their peers. And so let's say you're woke like the other schools, there isn't really a reason for students to choose your school. In terms of enrollments, we're seeing bimodal distribution. There are the schools that have more applicants than ever because they have a great brand name. And when they're stressed, people choose the schools that they think are still going to work out for them. But a lot of schools are struggling hard for enrollment. Those are the ones that are going out of business. And if they want to survive, they need to come up with something that's a really good mission that keeps them in the game. So, and in fact, this is something I wrote for the Martin Center maybe 15 years ago, that as the idea of a higher education bubble continues, we say, well, one day it will all pop. Well, even this past year, it didn't all pop. So I think the better metaphor is that it's a tire that's hissing out air over time. And maybe one day it's hissed out enough air, the car won't run anymore, and your college goes out of business or big sectors go out. But how do you stop that from happening? Other than a patch, which isn't going to last very long, you identify a core mission that students want to come to. So for instance, if you're a religious college, double down on what that is for you. If you're a liberal arts college, you better show that the liberal arts means enough to the students so that the outcomes are good. So we should also talk about, in terms of curriculum, that your income after college isn't the only thing you went to college for. I started by talking about the rhetorical skills that you need, the writing, the reading, the thinking, the personal development skills that you get from college. One of the reasons you go to college for the credential is because the credential represents that you've become a better person. There really are better and worse people. And you've said to yourself, I want to be a better person. I want this credential, not just so I can get a better job, but maybe I learned some ethics and I learned that I should drop out of school and care for my sick parent. And that's a great choice if you're the person who really should do that. Or many other kinds of choices you might make. So it's important to think about curriculum, not just in whether it's preparing you for a job and using, say, what Andrew Gillen of the Texas Public Policy Foundation calls the gainful employment equivalent, by which you look at debt versus income after a certain number of years, program by program, college by college, but also all of those intangibles, which are in fact, in many cases, the intangibles, what you call the soft skills that employers do want, but it's partly because it's actually you're a nicer person because you've learned how to play well with others, which a lot of students haven't learned to do. So when we ask colleges maybe to focus on their core mission of education rather than on all these extra things that might save the colleges that are ready to go out of business, but also might help the students focus on what's most important about spending all of this extra time in their city on a hill to become the kind of person they want to be. So have I taken my 20 minutes now? That feels like only 10, but okay. So I want to take a few more minutes and just go over some agreements and disagreements on the report's recommendations. So first, agreements. Vocational tracks, we said yes, especially while the humanities and social sciences are so broken. There's not much you're getting from them in most colleges anyway. So if you switch, you're not losing that much. Incentives to focus on the basics and having the legislatures restrict funds to think to the basics instead of call it critical theory, yes. Risk sharing by colleges, for sure. If colleges are on the hook for their own students' futures, that's great. Now, again, jobs, it's not the only thing. Transparency on spending, sure. You know, some newspapers in major metro areas will do that for you based on open records info. And so a disagreement then is, do you really need to have more mandates from the government to provide more data and to have a unit record system where you put a barcode on a student's forehead and track them? My answer to that is no. And that's been a point of debate among conservatives for a while. But if the idea is to have fewer requirements and less administrative bloat because of compliance, I think those kinds of new requirements might go in the wrong direction. Second, I'm not so sad about international students, which we didn't really talk about, but they're the ones who pay full price pretty much, and they're not very well subsidized. And part of the argument is they learn about America and then go back to their home country. America is still one of the more free countries, depending which place you go. So there's some extra benefit to that. And I'm not sure that we're losing money by having international students. We're probably gaining money in higher ed because of that. And then I just have to say that maybe the best part of the university today is the entrepreneurship programs, which this report doesn't like as much, maybe more in terms of the word entrepreneurship. But look, entrepreneurs are tempered by reality. You can't be woke and get a humongous offering. instead, what happens with the big tech companies is they had great tech first, and then they let their woke feathers out, right? Uh, and that's what happened. But if you're an entrepreneur, you first have to actually provide a real product that people want. And so if you're an entrepreneurial university, you're probably doing things right instead of wrong. And then finally, remedial education. So look, if you're good at everything and you're ready for college, but you just don't have enough math, should you be required to wait until you get the math and then show up? I would say no. I would say, all right, provide the remedial math. But if you're not good enough in 2 subjects, well, maybe that's the line I would draw. So if you need to get your writing in shape to be a college student and your math, then maybe that's a better compromise. So why don't I stop there because I wasn't paying attention to the time. So I apologize, but we'll go on to the next person.
Hello? Okay, I think I'm next. I'm going to be next. Executive Fiat. Um, and I want to thank everybody here, Neetu for writing such a great paper, Peter and everybody at NAS for putting together this event, everybody on the panel, and to my surprise, my colleague Anthony Hennon, who apparently did some early reading of drafts for you. So thanks to everybody. It was a great opportunity to travel for the first time in more than a year. I also want to offer some general praise for this report. Neetu, this is obviously an enormous effort, and I appreciate everything that you've gathered here. I think it's especially good to see a conservative organization put out a report that shows sensitivity to students, because I think too often we, in our zeal to say that we should not forgive student loans, come off as very callous as to the real hardships that students face. Obviously, students did choose the debt themselves. They took on that debt. But I think it's important for us to understand the consequences that students face because of the debt, because of these bad choices, and to make recommendations that can prevent this happening in the future. I also want to thank you for just some excellent footnotes. I know it's a very wonky thing to say, but I've already added several books to my wish list that I found in your footnotes, so thanks for that. But I think the most important thing is that this is a thorough analysis of why college costs so much. And I think many of us here and in the think tank world have understood why for many years. But it always bears repeating, especially since Congress, policymakers, boards of trustees, the public, students, everyone we have to convince still doesn't know. They still don't know why college costs so much. And so we have to tell this story over and over to make change happen. And I think that the policy recommendations are very good as well. And I'll talk about those a little bit later. But what I mostly want to talk about is a word that you mentioned towards the end of your talk, Neetu, and it was incentives. And I think that right now, our post-secondary education system in the US has all the wrong incentives for pretty much every actor who is involved in higher education. And this story is woven throughout the report, the story of bad incentives. Students have incentives to go to college. They've got the culture and the conventional wisdom that tells them that they have to go to college. That without it, they will be failures. And Neetu specifically says, now consider a middle-income American student. His parents and guidance counselors likely encouraged him to plan on attending college to move up in the world. He earned decent grades in high school and managed to gain admission to the college of his choice. He was pretty confident his proud parents would be able to support him, and he accepted his admissions offer. This is a really typical story. These are not great reasons to go to college, but the conventional wisdom says that you should, and so students follow that. I also hear all the time from people in my state that we must create a college-going culture. This is still the mindset of so many people that college is going to be a ticket to the middle class. It will be the way that people get access to economic mobility, and that mindset drives a lot of the problems that we have now. There's also the very real incentive of money. Money is available to go to college for through grants and loans. It is much less available for career and technical education or workforce training. And students also, as Neetu mentioned, believe that college will lead to higher wages. You know, and she points out a generation ago, American employers were eager to hire college graduates for decent jobs. College grads therefore had a reasonable degree of confidence in their professional prospects. And that's just not true anymore. Way too many of our undergraduates today are underemployed, but they still have the impression that college is their ticket. Parents have similar incentives to students. They want the best for their kids. And, I have a personal story to tell about this. So I obviously went to college. I'm the poster child for being in college for just way too long. Um, and my parents expected that my brother was going to do the same thing. And he told them, pretty point blank, he didn't want to go to college, but they insisted and they made him prove he didn't want to go by dropping out. Um, since then, he went on to get his licensure. He now does contracting for Duke Hospital and has become very successful in what he does in a technical skill in a trade. Um, but I think that the mindset of my parents was that, of course, you have to go to college. It was unthinkable that you wouldn't. And I think that so many parents think that way. Um, the incentives of college administrators are even worse. Um, Neetu mentions this, the Bowen's rule, which says that colleges are pursuing, specifically college administrators are pursuing prestige. They want to raise as much money as possible, and they want to grow. I think that she said that colleges are cookie monsters, gobbling up all the money that's available. And so the flip side of that is that unless something affects a college's prestige or a college's bottom line, administrators just don't care about it. They don't care about student success. They don't care about academic quality. They don't care about academic integrity or liberal education unless those things make them look better to US News or make them be able to attract more students and market to more students. And an example of this is the UNC athletics scandal several years ago. And administrators correctly interpreted that if they did enough, good PR, it wouldn't hurt their bottom line. So they didn't really fix the underlying problems. They didn't stop admitting athletes who could not um, academically qualify to do the work or to do the work at the university. Um, but they did paper it all over, and students continued to apply to UNC Chapel Hill. And in fact, they had record applications the year after the athletic scandal. And so I think that administrators they're uh, very savvy. And so they do the marketing, they do what looks good, they do what attracts students. They don't have an incentive to actually be better or to save people money. The faculty, I wish, had better incentives, but for most of them, the incentive is to keep your head down, keep your job, get tenure, publish, make sure you don't have any student complaints. And I think it was Richard Vedder who coined the phrase the student faculty non-aggression pact. Students will pretend to learn and I will pretend to teach and we will all be happy. Um, and I think far too many faculty, they just want to, they want to keep their heads down and do their research and not worry about the overall culture at their universities or the product that their university is offering. There's nothing in it for them to worry about those things. Employers, there's a similar dilemma. They want the cheapest way to find good candidates to hire. And the cheapest way to do that is to outsource all of their training to colleges and to let colleges screen their applicants for them through the degree process. Brian Kaplan, in his excellent book, The Case Against Education, said that degrees are essentially a screening tool to find out who is intelligent, has a good work ethic, and can conform to a set of rules. And I think that you'll find that that is what a lot of college students are doing. They are jumping through the necessary hoops to get their degree so that it can be their ticket to that first job after graduation. Um, and I think lastly, politicians who are, in control of all this, they have the worst incentives of the entire lot. They want to get elected and get reelected, and that is pretty much it. Um, and the way they do that is to hand out goodies like larger Pell Grants and subsidized loans and big research grants and maybe even college forgiveness. There are a very large number of people with college debt in this country, as Neetu pointed out, and they might be willing to vote for you if you give them a big write off for your college loan. I think it's also important to remember that politicians, almost all of them, almost all elected officials, personally and professionally benefited from going to college. And so when I go to the North Carolina legislature and I tell them, you really shouldn't be earmarking this money for UNC Chapel Hill, or you should try to fund degrees for 4-year degrees less and CTE more. I'm not just giving them a concept, I'm insulting their alma mater. And so that makes it especially hard to sell politicians on our vision for changes in higher education. Um, but all that said, we have to fix those incentives in order to fix the problems that Neetu pointed out. And I think that she has an excellent set of recommendations to do that. And I want to look at those briefly. Let's find them here. Okay. So the first one I want to talk about is her her suggestion that Congress should amend Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to allow employers to use alternatives to a college credential as a way to assess job applicants' work preparedness. And I think that is an excellent suggestion because it would allow employers to have another way to look at potential candidates for the job, and a different screening tool that they could use as an alternative to the degree. And so it does fix, one of the incentives in the many that I talked about. Um, the second excellent recommendation that Neetu makes, I think, is that universities, particularly public institutions, should create 2 to 3 year vocational tracks with classes staffed by industry veterans. I mean, I'm not entirely sold that it should be on the same campus as our current universities because, as Adam said, there's something in being distinct and offering a distinct product, and I think there's value to that. But I do think that there should be more vocational opportunities, more CTE opportunities, and I think as an addendum to Neetu's recommendation, we should take seriously the idea of making Pell Grant money available for short-term credential programs, and that could, it could exist along with vocational tracks at universities or the vocational tracks at community colleges. I think we undervalue um, the career education that goes on at those kinds of institutions. But I think that the biggest policy change that could possibly happen and that Neetu recommends is that colleges should have skin in the game. They should be on the hook for part of the student loans that students fail to pay back, because I think that that would cut the Gordian knot. That would unravel so many of the poor incentives that students and administrators have right now, because colleges would have to change their behavior radically to avoid paying off massive amounts of student debt. They would have to start caring about the quality of their applicants. They would have to care about educational quality. They would have to stop offering trendy programs with no return on investment for students. They would have to care about graduation rates. They would have to keep tuition more reasonable. They would have to help students find ways other than loans to pay for university. They would have to end non-instructional perks like lazy rivers and climbing walls and zip lines and therapy dogs or whatever else colleges are offering these days. And the bottom line is that colleges would shrink. They would shrink in the number of administrators because they would find that there are so many administrators that are not contributing to student success. They're not contributing to the instructional capacity at schools. And so colleges would only be made up of the people like faculty and students who really want to be there and the essential administration to get the job done. Um, I think that, as I said, that is the one reform that if I could pass only one reform, if I were queen for a day, that would be the one that I choose. Um, but I also like Neetu's suggestion that the federal government should replace the existing accrediting system because I don't think it's doing its job. I don't think it's doing anything. Um, and I would add that if we can't get skin in the game, that we should look at abolishing plus loans for graduate students and parents, and that we should look at the way we treat default rates. Right now, um, as Neetu said, accreditors, the guardians of which schools can get student aid and which schools can't. But another guardian of that money is the default rate and the way we treat that. And so what it looks like now is a massive number of students have to default before the federal government does anything to institutions that are just failing utterly. Um, what they should do instead is look at the number of students who are actually in repayment. So we flip it on their head, not how many people who have got, for whom it's gotten so bad they've defaulted, but how many people are actually making forward progress on paying back those loans. And if they can't get to a certain mark, then they should not be eligible for student loans or Pell Grants as an institution anymore. Um, but I think that bottom line, Neetu, excellent job. I think that this report is going to be valuable for really educating people on what's going on with our student loan crisis.
All right. Well, thank you, first of all, to Peter Wood and Dave Randall of the National Association of Scholars for inviting me here. Of course, thank you to Ms. Neetu Arnold for her striking and impressive report. Ms. Arnold really has done a great job, and she has a bright future. I look forward to watching that. I would like to thank my fellow panelists as well, and friends, Adam Kissel and Jenna Robinson, for all the great work they do for higher education and for making me look better by their physical proximity to me. It's funny because I guess I'm I'm actually an over-credentialed administrator, and I'm sitting here. I actually worried that we might be in an ambush, like eliminate the problem one administrator at a time, and y'all would just take me out. But I was like this when I was practicing law and I was a lawyer. I would criticize the ABA and I'd criticize state bar associations and all the things they do to sort of artificially inflate the cost of legal services. And now I'm a university administrator sort of holding forth against administrative bloat. And so I guess I'm just a traitor to my guild no matter where I am. And so maybe I'm either featured here as part of the problem or as a traitor. And we actually ate lunch right before this panel. So I'm like the embodiment of administrative bloat right now. I am feeling pretty full. So at any rate, shortly before the pandemic, I was back at my alma mater, Furman University, and I was speaking there, and I was doing what one does when they return to the alma mater. You sort of walk around the campus and take in the sights. Greenville is a beautiful place. This campus is in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I just always enjoy sort of strolling through campus. But it's a lot different from when I was there. First of all, my first day of college was 9/11. That was my first day of class. I walked out of my first class and got word that the World Trade Center had been struck by a plane, and it was really a confusing thing. But I graduated in 2005, and when I went to Furman, tuition was somewhere between 25 and 30,000, which seemed astronomical then. Now it's like 52,000. So it really is getting outrageous. But a lot of changes have taken place. The cafeteria, which was brand new when I was there, has since been redone and is unrecognizable. It looks so different from just however long ago I was there. It doesn't seem like very long ago. It's getting longer as the years go by, but I feel as if I just left that place. And also, there are just so many more administrators. The current president seems to be a wonderful person, but she has sort of modeled her administration off of Baylor University, where she served as provost, and she came out of the business school at Baylor, which is not in itself problematic at all. I'm in a business school now, even though I'm a lawyer with a PhD in English, but I think the way that she has structured the leadership at Furman is an odd fit, especially because Baylor is roughly 7 times as many students as Furman has. So it's not immediately clear to me that a liberal arts college of Furman's modest size that still purports to prioritize teaching and student learning over other outcomes requires this dense level of bureaucracy. But as I was walking around, I saw all these administrators' doors that were closed, and I'm sure they were out raising money or something, but they weren't there. But it reminded me of this quote by Pope John the 23rd. He was asked, "How many people work in the Vatican?" And his response was, "About half." And that's kind of how it looked to me. We had all these administrators and all their doors were closed. Um, but this report reminded me of a video that came out maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, not very long ago. It was the Wall Street Journal did it, and it was called How Public Universities Became So Expensive. And just to very briefly outline that video, it went something like this. Federal programs designed to make higher education more affordable have had unintended consequences of making higher education more expensive. The Higher Education Act, which has undergone many different iterations since 1965, has changed the way that universities obtain their money, namely through student loans and Pell Grants and some of the other things we've already discussed today. But the ready availability of student loan money has created perverse incentives for these schools to raise costs. So rather than charging less, which was the idea behind these student loans, oh, we'll make college more affordable, but they've actually caused colleges to charge more. Um, and then some of these universities have big endowments, but endowments have all these restrictions and they're tied into different things, and universities don't want to tap into them. And so universities are reliant, many of them, on tuition revenue, and that's where their income stream comes from, and that's why you see so many international students enrolling, because as Adam pointed out, a lot of them pay full tuition and pay full price. It's also the reason why out of state, it used to be it was hard to get into like a school. If you were out of state, it was harder to get into the in-state institution. But that flipped because out of state students pay out of state tuition. Totally different ball game now. Um, I was recently asked to write an article on Russell Kirk's views of higher education for the Political Science Reviewer. My friend Jeff Paulette at Hope College is editing a symposium on Russell Kirk's views, and this is the chapter that he asked me to contribute to. And so I started reading a book that Russell Kirk had written, and it was published in 1978. And it actually collected Kirk's writings from 1953 to 1977, so roughly a 25-year period. And Kirk wrote a lot about higher education. And it suggests to me that some of the trends that we are talking about today have been around for a long time. I mean, Kirk's book could have been written today. It reflects a lot of the things that we see in this report. But the foremost problem was that he observed that colleges were increasing enrollments at whatever expense to genuine learning and academic standards, and fundraising to build administrative resumes and reputations rather than intellectual curiosity and discovery for their own sake. So he critiqued this bigger is better mentality. You could be forgiven for presuming that the mission of the university system as it's currently constituted at most institutions today is not to impart wisdom, seek truth, contribute to the sum of knowledge, or cultivate clarity and understanding, but to amass power and money and influence, growth for growth's sake, funding for the sake of funding. Kirk called these, he referred to decadence. He used the term not as a, like moral or cultural decline, not as like lavish or pleasurable indulgence, but actually as an abandonment of real objects, aims, or ends. So he believed higher education had grown decadent by failing to pursue its fundamental mission and purpose, knowledge and truth, both for their own sake and for the sake of the student who draws moral instruction and clarity from them. In the book, Kirk writes that business as usual for universities and administrators in 1972 was looking for money, endeavoring to increase enrollments, or at least prevent shrinking enrollments. Wisdom and virtue, he mused, well, those were well enough for commencement addresses, probably. The business of the academy was academic business. So instead of cultivating the intellect, the American university was divided into two distinct parts. He called them the therapeutic community and a staging ground for social subversion. Miss Arnold's report identifies both of these in the contemporary university, from the woke politics to the therapeutic peer-led groups to intergroup dialogues that administrators impose upon faculty. And she has this line that could have been drawn straight from Kirk. She says, universities spend on luxuries to soothe and placate mentally unstable students, and these luxuries include the careful muffling of all unsettling ideas. She goes on to say, universities' investments in political activism and feel-good propaganda are not just ideological commitments, They are also ways to cater to student bodies comprised too largely of the entitled and the mentally unstable who, conflating comfort and safety, want universities to restrict the information they receive and the opinions that they hear. So Kirk explained that following World War II, colleges had begun to shift their focus from intellectual activities to pseudo-psychiatry. Instead of disciplining students' minds, which these new elements of the lonely crowd of the mass campus distinctly didn't desire, he said, universities and colleges began to minister to their feelings. The typical campus had become something more than a day hospital for emotionally disturbed young people. This is exactly what Miss Arnold describes in her report. So if universities were decadent in Kirk's day, imagine what he would have thought of them today. I do think that the basic predicate of the report is absolutely correct, that there's a causal link between federal student loans, aid, and skyrocketing tuition on the one hand, and administrative bloat and student debt on the other. Her critique of higher education is comprehensive. I mean, this report is amazing. I think I told her before we started today, I said, while I was reading it, I pulled it up, first of all, in a Word document and just started scrolling down. And it wasn't until I got to page 93 or something where I was like, oh, wait, this is a really long document, because I didn't really notice, because I didn't have a physical copy in my hand. I didn't really realize what it is I was getting into. I thought I was going to be done in 20 or 30 minutes. And here I was on page 93, and I still had a long way to go. So it is a really, really comprehensive report encompassing everything from trigger warnings to ideological diversity, speech codes, student and faculty activism, tuition, federal regulations, the decline in academic standards, sustainability, social justice, state disinvestment, U.S. News and World Report rankings, accreditation, and more. It is really an impressive document. She highlighted an interesting fact that I've never quite thought of, which is that we're entering into an era in which parents are paying off their student loans while their students are taking on student loans. It had never occurred to me that we might be in that era. And I realized that, oh, if I had had a kid when I was like 18 or 19 or 20, that child would be in college. And then I was sort of deflated a little bit, because I realized that I really am starting to get older. But she draws this, I mean, it's fascinating, some of the statistics in here. So here's one. Nearly 85% of students at four-year public and 90% at four-year private universities receive some kind of financial aid, and more than 40% of students, typically in the lower half of the income distribution, receive Pell Grants. She cites an interesting figure from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, holding that more than 40% of recent college graduates are underemployed, meaning that they're working part-time or working at jobs that in which they don't use their skills. So if college is supposed to be about employment and job prospects, as some people might say, or for maximizing the skills necessary to compete in the workforce and the workplace, well, then it's not achieving its goal. Arnold says the rise of America's underemployment economy suggests that we now suffer from an inefficient, highly wasteful distribution of education investment in human capital. Billions of dollars and millions of hours spent for little or no return. On the other hand, if college is supposed to be about personal edification or moral instruction to better the human condition, is like Kirk believed, it's not achieving that goal either. So not only is it decadent, but it's also just extremely wasteful. I guess you could make a case that maybe scientific and medical research is one area in which a certain field within the university is accomplishing some of its goals. Some of the research into illnesses and maybe vaccines and medical devices and those kinds of things. Some of that takes place, of course, through private enterprise, but some of it does take place in the university. But these are specific kinds of institutions serving particular fields within the broader university community. And they're distinct from the humanities and sort of the traditional liberal arts. But university administrators, they're fond of presenting the institutions as engines of economic progress. You hear this all the time. It's sort of like a refrain about how we are going to improve the economy, and these universities exist to sort of propel progress and all these things. But Miss Arnold shows that the student loan debt problem is actually a major problem for the economy. Aggregate American student loan debt, she says, now totals more than 1.5 trillion, incurred by 44 million borrowers. These 44 million borrowers have less disposable income, they consume less, and their savings are diverted to repaying their student loans. Would-be entrepreneurs must delay starting businesses, perhaps forever, while they pay back their student loans, and further, potential small business owners, made cautious by long years of debt, lose the taste for risk that is absolutely necessary for small business success. I think this is a tremendous problem. And another the interesting thing that the report raises is often conservatives blame the decline in traditional marriage and the family unit to sexual promiscuity and loose morals. Ms. Arnold shows that student loan debt is also a major factor because you have young people either delaying marriage or to defray the cost of living, they cohabit before marriage because it's just so much cheaper to combine two people's incomes into one. She bemoans the level of remedial education that occurs in today's institutions. And she shows that despite the complaints among administrators and maybe lobbyists that state institutions, the diminished state appropriations are a big problem, she shows that these institutions are actually spending more. It's not that they're having not able to cover what it was they're actually spending on all these new things, and they've got to keep the quote unquote growth in spending, the ballooning spending. They're seeking more appropriations, but there's no accountability or transparency when it comes to what they're spending money on. I do think it's kind of this push that we have for accountability and transparency is a difficult one, because I know that as soon as, say, an accrediting body says we're going to crack down on such and such of a trend. So I was an administrator at a law school before I was an administrator in a business school. In about 2010 to 2015, there was this big push in journalism to expose law schools for churning out too many graduates who couldn't find degrees, who couldn't pass bar exams, all this kind of stuff. So the ABA began cracking down on these law schools and adding additional layers of scrutiny. Well, okay, so that I guess is good that we're going to hold the feet to the fire of these law school administrators. But now you got all these law schools that are hiring people that we're going to hire a person to do reporting to the ABA. We're going to hire somebody that's going to do the reporting to NALP, the National Association of Legal Professionals. We're going to hire somebody to do all the reporting to the ABA. You've got to have people that now are in charge of all this transparency and accountability. So there's a tension between the need for transparency and accountability and the problem of administrative bloat that transparency and accountability are supposed to correct. I guess I would agree with Adam. I'm less concerned about globalism as a corrosive ideology. I think if your concern is knowledge for the sake of knowledge, I don't see that it's harmful to have sort of the best and brightest minds from other places coming here and teaching their peers, and also learning to appreciate our country and our ways. So I don't know that cutting back on international enrollment is a necessary thing. I think international enrollment is just a thing. Now, one thing that is kind of interesting is that we haven't really talked about is the Carnegie classification system, and it's related to a concern that Ms. Arnold expresses about the definition of expenditures in iPads, from which Carnegie draws its info. So it seems that all these big state institutions, any university that wants to be known as a research institution, desires this Carnegie R1 classification, and that is for highest research activity. The second category is for higher research activity, and the third for moderate research activity. And no one wants to be known as 2 or 3, when really the point of these classifications is categorical rather than ordinal. They fit universities within certain descriptive categories, but they're not ranking in order from best to worst. But university PR, firms and units will pump out all these press releases about we went from R2 to R1, and isn't that great? Well, really what that means, frankly, is that your university is spending a lot of money on research, but there's no way, they don't measure what research output is. So a university could theoretically just be throwing millions and millions of dollars at research, and no one could be publishing a thing. There's just no way to measure the outcome. But, oh, this is a high level research activity because it's spending a lot of money, not because it's producing stuff or even producing stuff of value, but because it spends a lot of money. I think that's a big problem. I think Richard Vedder is a friend of all of us, and he has this quote in Restoring the Promise which is his recent book. I think it came out last year, maybe 2 years ago now. But he says, I doubt there's a major campus in America where you couldn't eliminate very conservatively 10% of the administrative payroll in dollar terms, not firing people, but in dollar terms, without materially impacting academic performance, meaning the extent to which knowledge and creativity are disseminated and enhanced. Dr. Vetter has some legislative proposals about how to cut back on administrative bloat. He says, you could tie state appropriations to the size of teaching faculty payroll, or give universities bonuses where the faculty payroll exceeds the administrative payroll, stuff like that. I'm less, I don't know, convinced by legislative action in this area. And I think the best way to cut back administrative bloat is just start with our federal student loan program and just eliminate it absolutely entirely. Just end it. Just end it. Will that happen? Probably not. But it would solve a lot of problems in the long run. Yeah, there will be some hiccups. Yeah, there are going to be some rough years. But in the long term, we would all be better off. A few interesting things to note as we're considering the sort of eventual demise of many different kinds of institutions in our country is there's a birth rate decline in the United States, and apparently a birth rate decline internationally, and a drop in demand for higher education. So we know that there just aren't going to be the same number of young people to populate all these buildings and institutions. And now that we see that some forms of online learning are actually kind of working, it raises the question, well, why are we spending so much money on dorms and things like that when we don't have to be, when these people don't actually have to be present? Now, I am fairly traditional in thinking that sort of the classroom in-person instruction is just so much better, and there's something about learning with that in a kind of tangible way and being able to bond with your classmates that you lose over Zoom. I've taught enough Zoom classes to know that you're going to get somebody's initials up on screen, and you got student AF and student G whatever, and you're not actually going to see faces, and you can't elicit responses in the same way. There's no way to like motivate people through the screen and drum up excitement in the classroom. But if you have the right kinds of students, you can hold a Zoom classroom pretty well. I know the Mises Institute is an organization that teaches free market, and they're developing a new master's in Austrian economics, and they don't have that many students, and so the students that are going to this program are obviously really invested in it, and they do a lot of neat things. UFM, University of Francisco Marroquin in Guatemala, does a lot of really neat things. The way they do faculty governance is unique. I'm sort of on the fence of faculty governance. I've never quite figured out what the right answer is. I know UFM does not have a lot of faculty governance, and it seems to work really well. I know they hold their department's feet to the fire. If your department is not profitable and does not become profitable within a certain amount of time, it's gone. It's eliminated. And I can see that this model being very difficult. They don't have tenure. It'd be a difficult model to institute in the United States, but it's an intriguing model. Jenna mentioned universities having skin in the game. I really think that that's absolutely right. I know that comes in the report. Ms. Arnold suggests that college should be responsible, at least in part, for paying up for student defaults. Richard Vetter has this income share agreements idea that he champions a lot, involving universities investing in students' education costs in exchange for a share of their future earnings. So we'll pay part of your tuition now, and you can pay us back. We'll take a piece of your paycheck over time. That strikes me as being an interesting thing. But I'll conclude with, of all things, a fable, an Aesop's fable. So it's a fable, The Proud Frog. And there's this mother frog, and by the way, until I read this fable, I didn't know frogs have like tons and tons of babies. They get a lot of babies, so that makes this fable seem like less callous. But the proud frog is this mother frog, and she has all these babies that go wandering off, and there's this ox, and the ox steps on one of the baby frogs and kills the baby frog, and all the little froglets come hopping back to their mother, and they're trying to explain what it is that has just happened, but they don't have the language yet because they're babies to articulate what it is they've seen. So they say, "Mother, we just saw this big creature and it just squashed Jimmy," or whatever the froglet's name was. And she gets mad because she wants to be she's the biggest, baddest person around. And she said, was it this big? And she blows herself up a little bit. And they said, no, it was much bigger than that. And she takes offense and she says, was it this big? And they say, no, much bigger than that. And she starts getting angry. She blows herself up more. Was it this big? And they're like, no, mother, this thing was so much bigger than you. And she just finally reaches on and she said, all right, was it this big? And she blows herself up and boom, she pops. And I just wonder if our universities are like the proud frog and some of them are about ready to pop. I know Adam said we may not be at the popping point yet. This may not be like a 2001, 2002 Enron situation or 2008 Lehman Brothers where all of a sudden overnight, boom, things are gone. But it is trending in a alarming direction for university administrators. And the least we can do is start figuring out ways to curb administrative bloat as a starting point. The best thing would just be to end federal loans altogether. Unpopular thing to say, but I'm gonna say it.
I'm on now. Um, well, I'm delighted with this discussion so far. We've got some great questions in from our virtual audience. Before I'm going to turn to those, I'm going to take advantage of being the host of this event. The National Association of Scholars has been issuing reports related to this topic for some time. We have a Freedom to Learn amendments proposed to the Higher Education Act, which we've had around for several years. It covers some of this material. But when Neetu started, we were not yet in the Great Shutdown, and the anticipation of what was going to happen in this became a subject of a report we issued in June, I believe, of last year titled Critical Care. And it anticipates some of the concerns that the panel has been discussing. When Adam mentioned the binomial distribution of what's happening to colleges and universities, the idea being that some of them are thriving and some of them are in real trouble. I would complicate that picture. The ones that are thriving include not only the very high-end prestige institutions, it includes the flagship state universities for the most part, but it also, and interestingly, includes a category of low prestige but highly efficient institutions like the University of New Hampshire, the um, uh, Western Governors. Um, these are institutions that have gone deeply into online education and forms of instruction that just separate them entirely from the old pursuit of grand edifices and lots of administrators and so on. So there is a percolating there, this other thing going on. It's also a strange moment in which there have been a whole slew of new tiny colleges cropping up around the country. Seemingly at the moment when the creative destruction is taking place, the creative element is there as well. At the same time, the destruction hasn't happened as quickly as many of us had supposed. The Moody's was predicting, maybe still predicting, that about 20% of colleges and universities would be out of business within, I think their time frame was 10 years. We've seen only a handful of institutions so far close their doors, but many others are taking steps that look like they are, well, a troubling approach if you intend to survive. And that's where I want to ask the three of you. We have seen several developments in the last year that bear on this entire complex of tuition-dependent institutions trying to extract maximum income from their attendees and using that money strangely to prop up their administrative structures. So let me mention that one of the big developments of 2020 was the solemn pledge by hundreds, if not thousands, of college presidents that they were going to go all in on anti-racism. And what did that mean? For the most part, it meant hiring more diversity deans, more diversity, equity, and inclusion personnel all over the place. So there was suddenly a solemn pledge that we're going to spend yet more money on people not meaningfully engaged in any form of academic education. That's anti-racism. At the same time, we've seen this explosion of censorship, making the college and campus, if it ever gets back in place, a less welcoming one for students. Students have to go in expecting that they're going to be smeared or attacked. One would think that's an odd thing to do if you're sensitive to what the market might provide. We are seeing the transgenderism destroying women's sports. Again, you would think that's not a really shrewd market move. Tenure is being eliminated at a lot of colleges, or at least some prominent ones. I was reading today about Ithaca College. Adjuncts are coming in to replace full-time faculty members, meaning that the personnel who provide education are being downgraded in some forms. And lots of programs are closing at these colleges and universities. I could go on with that list, but it would seem to me that given the extreme financial crisis which the COVID shutdown precipitated, and given that that was coming on top of the demographic decline that Alan just mentioned, that is, several years ago, there were more than 20 million students enrolled in American colleges and universities. It's now down to about 17.5 million, and it's continuing down. We know simply from the trajectory of demography, the students won't be there to even sustain 17.5 million unless they are replaced with either more international students, or we find a way to get the students who are now not attending college to do that, the exact opposite of what we would like to see happen. In any case, that's the situation we face. I'm wondering whether you think our highly paid and very large core of college and university administrators haven't heard the message. You can start with Adam.
Thanks. You mentioned a bunch of topics. The gorilla in the room, really, as you mentioned, are these humongous online universities that don't need the bricks and mortar, don't have endowment, but can grow like crazy and don't need to have all those other things because you're at home. You don't need a student life set of officials telling you how to live in the neighborhood because the school is far away from you. So I think that's a very important point that we had left out until now. So thank you for that. A lot of us still think of the traditional four-year residential school as where students go to college. That's just not the case, hasn't been the case for a long time, but that's still the traditional model that we kind of have culturally in our head about where all of the post-secondary students are. But a ton of them are online, a ton of them are at community colleges, and a ton of them are not at these four-year residential colleges where you have the wokest of the woke. So the students who are, I think, also often have large enough endowments that they are going to weather this storm, and they often do have the brand name. And why would administrators want to get the message if they're being protected in all these different ways? And that's maybe all I want to say about that. But as for these upstart new projects, so Max Weber in Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, talks about the iron cage, the steel hard shell that you're in, whether you like it or not. If the people around you are providing all of these great benefits, you have to start providing them to compete, even if you don't want to. So unless you're really doing something special and small, and you can persuade a minimum number of students that that's okay without the climbing wall and all the rest, you might still be stuck. And in a few years, you say, well, everybody else is asking for diversicrats, maybe we need to have some too. And whether you like it or not, you might feel like you have to do it because there's rankings on all of these woke issues. And now you're far down in all of those rankings. But if you want to have enough students, maybe you still have to do it against what you want. So that's what I'll say for now.
Add that I think universities are very aware of the demographic decline. I hear our university boards of governors in North Carolina talk about it all the time. We're in a fortunate situation in North Carolina. North Carolina is growing, but it's not growing in its population of young people as fast as it's growing in its population of 30 somethings coming for jobs. Um, they are very aware of it, and the tactics that they have come up with are to reach out to the populations who, as you said, have not been going to to universities in the past, and entice those people to come to universities. And some of the ways they have done that are extremely disappointing. They have lowered academic standards. They have started to offer in-state tuition to people in other states. They try to offer in-state tuition for athletic scholarships. So really, they've decided that instead of the enrollment is so important that they will stop upholding the standards that they have said are their guiding posts all along. And so they know this is coming. And I think that the competition will simply be fierce over the number of existing students that there are and over the people who they see as possible potential students.
You're dead zone.
All right. Hello. Double fisting. Okay. Yeah, I totally agree that that administrators are not blind to this problem. I think that actually big state flagship institutions and the sort of the high-end prestigious institutions like Ivy Leagues and stuff, they're 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 spending and doing things as normal because they know that if they just keep outspending everybody else in this arms race, eventually the competition is going to just be obliterated. And there will be eventually fewer institutions for them to have to compete with. So they're doing what they always have done, and they can innovate here and there, but they don't have to do some kind of wholesale restructuring because they're just waiting it out. It's the smaller schools, especially the private liberal arts schools that maybe once had a religious identity and mission and they've drifted so far from it. I mean, who needs another Oberlin or Grinnell or something like that? They're just a bajillion of them. They're all interchangeable. If you're going to go to a private liberal arts school that's going to be just woke university, I mean, you got a million to choose from. Why choose one over here rather than over there? Like schools like that they have got no identity, no future. They are the ones that are going to struggle, especially if they're already financially strapped. I know that a lot of private Christian colleges are still are struggling too. But I also know a few that are just sort of doubling down on their mission and identity because they're saying, hey, if we don't and we become just like everybody else, then we have nothing to offer. We just die out. And I respect those presidents that are taking those stands and working in that space. And I hope that we do see some enrollment moving in that direction. The other thing is just for certain, I think that it is time to start building parallel institutions. I mean, I know we're operating in a landscape in which, you know, certain institutions, the Harvards and the Yales and the state universities have been dominant for so long. But when the education it becomes so wasteful and poor, I just wonder whether it's time to start considering building parallel institutions. And some of these things, Thales Academy now has a university, and I know other people are experimenting. And it may be a long way away. It may be outside of our lifetimes when we see those things reach fruition. But I'm encouraged by at least the beginnings of it, at least the conversations getting started. Because conversations have been going on for a long time, but at least now people are taking action and doing stuff. Because if no one starts doing stuff, nothing's going to happen.
I've got a fairly hefty string of questions here. I think this first one is directly to Neetu from an audience member in California. How do we encourage students to choose paths outside of college when few such paths exist, especially those with good future pay?
I think that's an excellent question, and you are right that there aren't that many paths right now where you could do something outside of a typical college degree. And that's the chosen path. But I think there's some alternatives with proper planning. For one, if you're looking for a cheaper way to go to college, I would recommend getting your general ed requirements done at a community college and then transferring to state university. That's one option that I think would be excellent. And especially if you're a student where you're academically gifted, I think going to a state school would be beneficial just because they may have honors programs and the school can spend more resources and time uh, on the academically gifted students. And these universities have an incentive for that. They want to make sure that these students are successful so that they can advertise them and say that we're such a good university and you should come to us. So I do think that's a mutually beneficial option. In terms of expanding options, though, outside of college, that's why I promote the idea of having a 2 to 3 year vocational track, which would be different from a 4 year liberal arts education track, where the 4 year track, you could learn a variety of subjects, whereas the 2 to 3 year track would be focused on, it would be more focused on technical skills for the specified job. But that, I do think we need more options because the current system, I think it just pigeonholes a lot of people.
This is a question that I think anyone here can take up, which is how do we reform the federal student loan program so that it does not encourage increases in tuition? Is that possible?
Hello? Got it. Okay. No, I think the solution to that is skin in the game. You make colleges responsible for part of the defaulted debt, and that would mean that there would be intense pressure on them to not make tuition so high that they're on the hook for a lot of money. And there was actually a real world experiment done that I think proves the point that this would happen. And that is during the Obama administration, there was very briefly a time when parent plus loans were subject to credit checks. And when that happened, the number of parents getting plus loans declined precipitously, especially in low income households. And the colleges where these students often attended, especially HBCUs, when that happened, they dropped their tuition. And so I think that is all the evidence we need that if you do cut off the money, if you cut off the spigot, or if you make colleges responsible for a portion of it, that they will respond, and they'll respond quickly, because they know what's in their best interest. But I do think that you can't make a lot of rules. You can't try to um, and you can't try to regulate your way into making colleges keep tuition low. You've got to change their incentives.
Neetu, could you talk a bit about the role of accrediting agencies, the role they're playing in administrative bloat? Are not, quote, best practices driving much of the increase in university costs?
Well, I think with the accreditation requirements, a lot of times they have certain expectations, and if universities don't meet them, then they're kind of in trouble. And so, a lot of times now, accreditation agencies, for example, they will um, require some sort of investment in diversity, and so or Title IX, or and so, in order to meet those requirements, they need to, the universities believe they need to invest more in these officials so that they don't, it's seen as an insurance policy so that they don't get reported. So, I do think the accrediting agencies, I do think we need to reform them. They are quite outdated at this point. If parents and families and students are also looking for um, signals for college quality, they usually go to other places. They might visit campus, they might go to US News and World Ranking or any other ranking website. And so I do think there needs to be some sort of reform there.
Anyone else want to take that one on?
I'll just add that accreditation is a minimum standard, right? You have to meet the minimums or you get in trouble. And there's 3 different places you can go to be told whether you meet the minimums: the state authorizer, the federal government, or the regional or national or subject matter accreditor. You probably don't need all 3 or 4 of those, right? So we can reduce some of the trouble by saying, well, if you meet minimum requirements for your state, why should the feds care?
The best practices part of that question, do accrediting agencies represent best practices? Well, I served on several accrediting commissions and had a lot of experience with them as an academic administrator at Boston University and the King's College. It always struck me that the best practices were the very last thing that ever crossed an accreditor's mind. These were looking for ways to promote particular ideologies on campus. Sometimes they were paying close attention to finances, but as to the quality of instruction within a college or university, I never saw it, and that's over 25 years of administrating. It just didn't happen. Okay. Are there any realistic plans for realizing the solutions suggested in this study? Well, I guess that's to you, Neetu.
Could you repeat that question again?
Are there any realistic plans for realizing the solutions suggested in this study?
You know, I think one thing that I ask in the report is that universities that are funding ideological roles or politically driven, there should be funding cuts that could be attached to that. And I think at the federal level right now, that may not be realistic, but it's definitely possible at the state level. I think if our state lawmakers are aware of what's happening and the fact that many of the things that are taught on college campuses or that are promoted to through various services are divisive, they are not relevant to instruction, I think there's a case to be made that it's not even benefiting the public, because many of these universities, they receive state appropriations, and that's through taxes, which is through public funding. And so if these services or the instruction is not of benefit to residents of that state, then I think it's very much possible to kind of cut the funding if universities continue to hire people in such roles.
Anyone on the panel want to ponder that one? Going once? Okay. To what extent are women both driving more likely to demand therapeutic services and suffering, enrollment rising versus flat for men, from the rising costs of college more than men? Well, I might want to edit that question a bit. Let me see if I understand it. Are women, first of all, driving the costs disproportionately because they demand more therapeutic services than men? Let's take that first.
I mean, I'm not sure if women in particular are driving these costs. I think it's, and when we talk about student demand here, is it, when we see these different services, is it that students are demanding these services and administrators are responding? Or is it the other way around, where for so long our colleges keep building new buildings and they expand the various luxuries that are offered, and so we're conditioning students and families to expect those services? I actually think it's the second one. I think there are many. I think it's happening more at the administrative level, where they're I can't think of the word. They're instituting these services, and then students want more, and then it just becomes this feedback loop that never really stops.
I think I can address part of that, and that is to say that women do, and it's the other half of the question that I'm going to talk about. Women do, on average, have higher debt levels than men. I think that's the other part of the question. Um, I don't see that in itself as a problem. I think a lot of people, do just because there is an imbalance, and every time there's an imbalance, there must be a problem. Women have more debt than men because more women are going to college than men. So it's a natural phenomenon. As to the other question, I don't know the answer, but I think that the two excellent books have been written about the therapeutic tendencies of universities. The Rise of Victimhood Culture is one of them, and then, of course, The Coddling of the American Mind. And I think that both of those address kind of the where these phenomenon came from, and probably could go a long way to answering the question as to whether there are gender differences in who is demanding these services.
Okay, so Neetu's theory is if they build it, they'll come approach, and the other is the uh, sociological idea that's been around, I guess, since Philip Reith and therapeutic culture, that this has become an expectation among all Americans that our problems are to be ameliorated by seeking therapy. So why wouldn't colleges be the hub for that? Um, that sounds like a good next project for the National Association of Scholars. Let's find out. Um, Airline spending on pilots, this is starting out in an interesting way, has steadily fallen as a proportion of total spending. No one complains. Why should spending on faculty be any different? I'm going to turn to Alan on that, actually. He's a market guy.
So I guess the point behind the question is they're saying, we should spend less on faculty. Like maybe they're not complaining about the adjunctification of faculty or something. Is that sort of the purpose behind? I mean, I it's if the system works in another way, I mean, I don't see why it's a bad thing to pay people less if that's what if you've got the system working. I mean, Jenna, do you have a more sophisticated response to that?
And my answer is the airplanes aren't falling out of the sky. And the higher education system is, metaphorically. And so we are complaining about the way that higher education spends its money because it's failing spectacularly in the service it is supposed to give us. Airlines, on the other hand, are still getting us from place to place. It's uncomfortable and the food is disgusting, but it works. It works a heck of a lot better than higher ed is right now. And so I think that that is the source of the complaint, is they are misappropriating their resources in such a scandalous way that students are coming out, without anything that resembles the kind of education that they're promised.
Okay. How do we get away from schools using price as an indication of quality? When one school increases its price, many of the other schools will follow for fear of being perceived as of lower quality. Neetu?
Well, I think it has to do with how we tie college as the gatekeeper to success and for, both happiness and vocational success. And I think if college wasn't seen as this necessary rite of passage, there wouldn't be so much pressure to first for parents and children to go to college, to invest in a college education necessarily. They could look to other sources. And I think if you reduce that sort of pressure, I think universities could make their own choices. They wouldn't be looking to other colleges and saying, this college did, they raised their price here, or they hired this administrator. We need to do that too. And so I think there needs to be just less pressure on going to college in the first place.
Once upon a time, there was a campaign by the whiskey maker Chivas Regal that would portray these very expensive whiskeys as so precious that a grown man would be reduced to tears if he dropped it on the floor. When I worked for John Silver at Boston University, he was a relentless price increaser. Our tuition went up spectacularly year by year, and he always viewed it as, yeah, we make ourselves more expensive, we make ourselves more attractive. He wasn't really concerned much with what other places were charging, except that he always wanted to have the second or third highest increase in the country each year. So there really is something to be said for tricking people into thinking that a high price represents high quality. Any other ideas about how we get out of that?
Well, I was going to say, just there are the one actually good thing about our higher education system is that there is a lot of variety. There are a lot of institutions that are designed to do lots of different things and provide different kinds of education. And I think back to, not to return to airplanes again, but Delta and Southwest, when Delta tried to be Southwest or Southwest tried to be Delta, and they tried to change the business model, it didn't work. If you're if you're a Holiday Inn or a Motel 6, you're not going to try to be a Ritz Carlton. There are lots of different types of institutions. Some people like to drink some kind of expensive craft beer. Some people like a natty light or whatever it is. There are just lots of different choices out there. And I think, schools that market themselves as being affordable and take pride in that, that's a good thing. I think, Mitch Daniels freezing tuition at Purdue, that's a big marketing, that's a big marketing thing for them. We're not going to raise your tuition. Or imagine if schools start actually lowering tuition and saying, look, we're gonna give you high quality education for cheap. I mean, I think eventually it's got to go that direction, because the universities have to respond to the changes in demographics, the changes in population, the changes in the market. I mean, a lot of people are realizing that you don't have to go to college. I mean, you could go, and if you wanted to be a plumber and make a pretty good income on that without having to go into debt, why would you go to college if you didn't think you needed to learn anything? And people are starting to realize that. I think that's a lot what Brian Kaplan talks about, is just being a college degree is just a signal to some employer that you're willing to spend 4 years of your life working at something, but it doesn't mean you actually have any knowledge in your head about how to do anything. It just means you're willing to put in the time and effort, and that just shows some employer that, okay, I'm willing to work for you and work hard, but it doesn't mean you can actually do the job, or that you're in any way equipped to do the job, which is why, it's a tough job market for young people out there. They're going and taking jobs that don't pay that much. And a lot of young people have, they go into college starry-eyed thinking they're going to come out and make these big salaries, and they don't. And then they're saddled with debt. And, eventually these things will work their way through the system. I mean, we're feeling the a particular pain of it now, but it's unsustainable. The whole thing's unsustainable.
May I? So we don't teach financial literacy very well at the high school level, and it doesn't seem to exist at the college level almost at all. Right? Your entrance and exit interview on your student loans is a formality that nobody wants to do on either side of the table. So that's part of it. But then I'll return back to the gainful employment equivalent work that Andrew Gillen at TPPF has done. So if you have enough financial literacy to want to look up what's likely to happen if I graduate from this college with that degree, and you see that maybe $200,000 worth of tuition isn't going to cut it, you say, oh, well, maybe I need to change my degree or my college.
Well, let's hope that the market actually works. Matt Lind, I have a name here, is asking, how will skin in the game work when universities give up standardized entrance exams? Berkeley last year was harder to get into than Stanford. This year, without the SATs, applications at Berkeley have exploded. I will be hiring less from colleges like that in the future, by the way. So skin in the game does run into this problem that the colleges have put on a veil of ignorance. They won't have any real knowledge of the quality of the students they admit. So how does skin in the game end up producing higher quality students? start with Adam because I think you were the first to mention skin in the game.
Well, I think Jenna said that admissions will need to change and be smarter if you have skin in the game and you need to know if somebody's going to succeed in college or not. And if you don't want to go the test score route, then you better find some other measures.
Yeah, if you're responsible for paying default, or if you're responsible for recruiting students that aren't going to go out and succeed, that's your fault. As a college, I think skin in the game is the answer to. I don't see. Even with standardized tests, yeah, I sometimes wonder how much of a measure they really are and predicting student success. I think even of like the bar exam for lawyers, it's sort of, it tests general legal knowledge that you're supposed to learn in law school, and it probably shows which people study better than others and spend the time. In theory, everybody who's studied for law school exams and put all that work in ought to be able to go in and pass a bar exam. But like the LSAT or something like that, the LSAT has absolutely nothing to do with what you're going to learn in law school, and it's maybe it's a measure of how well you do different kinds of logic games, or it may measure in some way where your strengths lie or how you can take a particular test, but it really has nothing to do with how good of a lawyer you're going to be. So I think putting skin in the game is if colleges are on the line, if they would do an income share agreement like we talked about, where you enroll students and that they are going to be paying back a portion of their income to you over time. Well, you're not going to pick the person who's not ambitious, doesn't look as though they will be able to earn any money. And so I don't really see how the test score affects that, other than it's just one less indicator that you have when you're an admissions officer to tell, like, oh, well, what does this person look like? Holistically, what does this application look like? You can look at grades and you can look at extracurricular activities or whatever, and this is just one less factor that you have. And I see that being problematic. But if it's the SAT or if it's the ACT or whatever, I don't know that there's anything special about the SAT itself or the ACT itself.
Let me ask the question that is behind Matt Lynn's question, I think. The reason that the SATs are going out is that they produce disparate results on racial groups. And anything that produces disparate results on racial groups will eventually be jettisoned from our colleges and universities on the grounds that it's implicitly racist or systemically racist or something like that. In that case, we end up with the problem that, unfortunately, a fairly hefty percentage of the underperforming students are Black or from some other minority groups, in which case the complication that lies in this is that skin in the game is clearly going to be a racist enterprise in the view of many people.
I think we've gotten to the point where everything everywhere all the time is racist. I read an article on Inside Higher Ed that says university lectures are racist. Not the content of the lectures, just lectures. And so I think that there will come a point at which the public has the woke people who are trying to get all these changes made will have cried wolf too many times, and people will realize that something like the SAT or the ACT is in fact innocuous. And I think that if you do, the first question, if you do implement skin in the game, I think those standardized tests will come roaring back and people will use them again. But I do think that we are getting to the point where, wokeism and, critical race everything has jumped the shark. I think a lot of people are starting to see the value in simple non-discrimination, equal opportunity, and just are sick of everything, regardless of its actual content, being called racist.
I think Alan, Jenna, and Adam kind of hit on a lot of my points related to skin in the game, but I just think that with given he mentioned admission standards, even if you try to get rid of the admission standards, I think there's always going to be something else, and that doesn't mean you don't hold colleges accountable, especially when they knowingly admitted people who I think there were some indications where they wouldn't make it, or if you look at the grades, they they were not prepared, and so there still needs to be a way to hold the colleges accountable. And I do think skin in the game is a good way to hold them accountable.
Well, and also there's a narrative issue. So for a long time, what law schools purported to be doing was diversifying their class when they were admitting people that maybe had low LSAT scores and low GPAs. And the idea was that added diversity to the classroom enriched the educational experience. But then the narrative began to change when people were taking on a lot of student loan debt to go to law school, and then they weren't passing the bar exam. And then all of a sudden, that system that was supposedly benevolent becomes predatory. And now the system is, oh, well, now you're exploiting young people who, with these promises about a legal career and how great their life is going to be and how much money they were going to make as a lawyer. And you are bringing them in and you're forcing them into poverty, essentially, and you're making what was maybe a, 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 a bad station in life even worse. And so that becomes, a process. So, I mean, I think, eventually the problem will become evident in some way. I think, again, if the federal student aid is really the root cause of a lot of these problems, or at least complicates some of the problems that are existing in other areas.
We're almost out of time, but there are a few more questions here I'd like to squeeze in. Um, Barry is asking about the skin in the game issue again. He asks, wouldn't skin in the game as a policy just lead to schools lowering their standards even further to make sure everyone graduates and is thus, quote, a success from a student loan perspective?
Isn't that what's already happened? I mean, isn't that why now you have to get a master's degree instead of a high school diploma? I mean, really, if you want to get a job that used to require a high school diploma, now it requires a graduate degree.
So, but
The skin in the game idea has to do with what happens to you after you graduate. So the college is actually better off probably failing you out or getting you out of the college before you graduate, so that you're not in the data for what your income versus debt ratio is.
okay. Uh, Daniel is asking, what percentage of colleges are culprits of the troublesome issues mentioned in this report? Are there colleges that are performing well that we can look to as a model, or are they all, quote, falling from the sky, as Jenna mentioned?
So I don't have an exact percentage on all the schools, but I think one thing to note with the study is that we looked at 50 universities, and many of them are either well-known schools or they're in the top of their league. And something I've noticed is that the schools that are in the top of the league set the trends for other universities, and so I I think that a lot of schools are uh, are doing many of the things that we don't like, as seen in our report. But I think some schools that may be doing a good job. Yeah, I got to talk to the president of Berea College, and I think one thing that they do well is their mission is just really good. They Students are admitted to the college and they also get to work at the college, and so I think you get work experience along with a college education. Now when I talked to the Berea College president, he did say that this model may not be replicable at every school because it depends on the mission, and this is a mission Berea College has had for over a century. But I think there's some things that we can learn from schools like Berea on maybe what kind of educational model we have and where our priorities are.
Okay. There's a quick question here from a listener who says, what does skin in the game mean? Can you give us a succinct answer?
I mean, basically, the colleges must suffer consequences for their bad decisions. They need to be investing in their students and not just, you know, extracting federal funds.
Well, literally what it means is that they would be paying back part of the money that they had extracted from the students through student loans.
Yeah,
So
they're the ones that are responsible for yeah, precisely.
um, one audience member, he's disagreeing with you, Alan, says that 10% is a pretty small number of administrators to cut. Is there an ideal percentage we should cut administrators to fundamentally readjust the character of the institutions? I should mention that the NAS has been promoting the idea that they should be cut by 50%. So you're being generous.
Well, the 10% figure, I should point out, was drawn from Richard Vedder's book. So that is not a figure I came up with. I have not done any kind of, quantitative empirical study on this. I was just citing Richard Vedder's figure. So I'm happy to defer to the NAS as 50%.
Rich was being uncharacteristically nice that day. He's a large reason why we have this report. He advised us early on, and his book is terrific. So a shout out to Rich on this, and shame on him for only wanting to cut 10% of the heads. From Day, given Neetu's suggestion that the emphasis should be on fewer people attending college, would a universal basic income contribute to that end?
That's an interesting connection. I don't want to come off and support universal basic income unless it's absolutely necessary. I think the problem with a universal basic income, you're kind of forcing it onto people, and then we're also saying students should just go to college, and then they get this education, but they're anyway going to be staying at home and getting an income, so it doesn't really matter what the educational quality is. And so I'm not so sure about a universal basic income equation into this, but it's an interesting thought.
This last question is also for you, Neetu, from Holly. I appreciate the information that will be helpful as current and future students navigate financing their education, but what answers are available for the 45 million people that already have student loan balances?
So I think for those who have student loans, and especially for those who are not seeing the benefits of taking out those loans, whether you dropped out and so you took out those loans, but you don't have a degree to show for it, I think those are dire situations, and we should be looking for solutions. But I will say one thing. We have two kind of groups here. We're trying to prevent future students from taking on debt that they cannot pay back, and it's crippling a generation. And we also have people who are in a dire situation right now. And so I don't think these two groups or the priorities need to compete with each other, but I do think order in which we do things do matter. So I think the first thing is to contain the fire, which is stopping students from going into this massive debt. And then I think we can talk about concessions at a later time.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up now. First, thank you to the audience, both seen and unseen, to the few brave souls who actually came here in person. I'm delighted you did. To our panelists, Adam, Jenna, and Alan, thank you also for coming and for providing this very rich commentary on the report. We've been taking notes. The questions of what do we do next with this? I think there's some great things on the table. We wholly endorse, the National Association of Scholars does, the idea of skin in the game. We're also very intent on trying to find pathways for young people to careers that don't necessarily involve getting college degrees. 2- and 3-year vocational tracks look pretty impressive. The mini diplomas around tightly focused courses that certify a particular skill or a useful part of education. A great many Americans want to act responsibly towards the loans that they've taken out, the debts that they currently owe. We want to help them find ways to do that in answer to that last question. But we also want to help the next generation avoid getting into this same deep hole. We want to make sure that the taxpayers' money in this country is not spent profligately on the unnecessary salaries of legions of administrators who add little or nothing to the quality of an education. And we want to weed out the useless college degrees, those college degrees that not only fail to certify someone as capable and knowledgeable within given subject areas, but do nothing to shape the character of students for the better, to inculcate virtue or support for our self-governing republic, but instead turn students into alienated, weak, and pathetic people who can see nothing more for their life than a path of endless therapy. Uh, if that's what college gives us, we would certainly be better off with ratcheting that down. The American people have plenty of good sense to call upon here. It's worth our time and energy to figure out how we can help that energy be channeled to more productive directions. We have hard work ahead of us, enacting good principles in our legislation federally and at the state level, and persuading colleges and universities, including the independent ones, that these are steps that are needed. I think we can expect state legislatures, at least some of them, to exercise pretty good oversight on the direction in which their public colleges and universities are going. To some extent, their private ones as well. But we face headwinds at the federal level, no doubt about that. A scalpel might be a more effective instrument in making the cuts than a corset, but a corset is probably the more practical measure at this point. We have to expect to find ways to incentivize the improvements in higher education that we're talking about. Um, Ultimately, we will need to change federal law. The major law that governs all of this is the Higher Education Act of 1965. It's up for reauthorization and has been for a long time without being actually addressed. We think that's one of the places where this intervention is going to happen, an intervention in favor of creating incentives for the right kinds of change and eliminating the incentives right now that simply encouraging administrative bloat and out of control student debt. That's going to be a big push, but it's a necessary one. We will do all that we can to advance that, and I hope those of you who tuned in today came away with the idea that these are changes that can and should be made. So thank you all again for attending, and I hope that you will be there in person at the launch of the NAS's next report. Good day.